All right, there we go. Okay. So on Tuesday, we were talking about, whoops. We were talking about psychopaths, and we concluded with this comparison between psychopaths and antisocial personality disorder and conduct disorder. And we came up with the conclusion that at this moment, psychopathology is not considered a disorder because it doesn't meet those criteria that we've talked about. And the other thing at this point, even though there's some new research coming out that looks hopeful, for the most part, psychopathology does not seem treatable, okay? And we were leading to psychopaths to talk about another type of evilness, which is serial killing, which is different than the homicides that we talked about before, because these are usually done for very sadistic reasons. And the reasons why we started with psychopaths is there's this notion that all serial killers are psychopaths, but not all psychopaths are serial killers. So kind of wanted to start with this beginning component. Now, I will say that people who meet the pattern of serial killing don't always necessarily follow this line, which I'll explain a little bit later, but that this is kind of the notion of pure evilness then turning into the deliverer of death. So first of all, let's start with what is the definition of a serial killer? And this comes from the FBI. So this is the definition they use. It's usually used in all the other literature that explores this in the scientific and social science areas. But the FBI sets up three criteria that define this type of killing. Is usually it's killing in 3 or more separate events. And this is an important component when it states separate events. And the reason why this is important is that if it occurs in one event, then what we have is a mass shooting. It's a mass killing rather than a serial killing event. Now, with that being said, there is some deviation from this, in that there are serial killers who are known to go in and murder, for example, a family at the same time. But what sets them aside from, let's say, other killers is some killers will go kill one family and that's it. A serial killer would then kill another family in another separate event. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of note that difference.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Okay. My Siri is acting funny. Okay, so we have 3 or more events, and it also is 3 or more separate locations. Okay, now we do know that some serial killers will pick up their victims in one place and then sometimes take them to a similar location, but that's usually to expose of their body. The killing usually takes place within the place where the serial killer found the individual. But there's even deviation from this. We know that Gacy took the young people to his house, and so did Dahmer. So there is some differences in this, but it's from different locations. And this is probably the hallmark of serial killing, is that there is a period between each murder that is called an emotional cooling off period. Okay. What usually this cooling off period is that the murderer will hold the event in their mind and replay it over and over and over. And once they can't remember it as well, as when that memory depletes and they don't get the same fantasy off of it, that's when they will go seek another victim. Okay. Now, for some, an emotional cooling can be 24 hours, 8 hours. For some, it could be a couple months. For some, it could be 10 years. It all just depends on how, I hate to say this, how well that individual is able to hold that murdering fantasy in their head. Okay. So, what are some things that we know about homicides? Well, we know one thing, that before the 1900s, they were fairly rare. Okay. In that it wasn't until after the 1900s that we saw a huge increase in the number of serial killings occurring here in the United States. Okay. Now, the current theory of why this happens is, if you think what happened between 1900 and 1924, is the United States went through the Industrial Revolution. And this urbanized people, this put people in closer and closer contact with each other. We see people moving from farms into cities and becoming close neighbors. And and the other part of it is, so you have people coming in closer proximity to each other, but then you have this change in mentality. In that pre-industrial period, you really were the person who destined your life. Okay, we were more of an agricultural society then. We were more of you produced your product usually at your home or something like that, or in an office space that wasn't in a factory or something like that. And then you went and sold your goods. Okay. Through the mercantiles or whatever it may be. Starting with the Industrial Revolution, and you start larging factories, your destiny never stops becoming your own. Your destiny is now based upon your employer. Okay, and so it's this kind of loss of freedom combined with the close proximity of coming into each other. It has created kind of this frustration of individuals to seek out ways to deal with darker and darker desires. When we look at reasons why individuals kill, I noted that in non-psychopathic killings, so this is domestic homicide, gang homicide, family homicide, that the majority is pretty reactive. And with that being said, there is still a good amount of individuals who do it primary for instrumental reasons. Primary instrumental reasons is a gang taking revenge for territory issues, a husband killing his wife for insurance purposes, or so that he can have a relationship with someone else, like the individual in Colorado did, those kinds of things. And this one, the reason why this is important is this takes thinking, this takes planning. Okay. When we look at the psychopath, they very rarely do it in a moment of passion or just a reaction at the moment. The majority of the time, they're doing it for some usually sadistic or take advantage of someone purposely. Okay, so these individuals are very much more methodical. They think about their homicide, how they're going to go about it, and the reasoning. It's going to serve some purpose for that individual. Okay. When we look at typology, of serial killers. We find that there are four. Okay. Visionary serial killers are those who feel impelled to commit a murder because they had a vision or a voice in my head, in quote unquote voices in my head. And I just want to clarify it because remember when we talked about things like schizophrenia and psychosis, most of the auditory hallucinations, voices in the head, are self harming, meaning that a schizophrenic usually has voices that humiliate the individual, those types of things. This usually is ignited by some type of drug or alcohol that the individual is taking. They already have the intent, but then under some type of substance or something, they create these voices and hear these voices in the head. Because remember that things like methamphetamine, cocaine, up those levels of dopamine, and hence the auditory hallucinations that many hear. Okay, so mission-oriented killers feel it's to be their mission in life to kill certain kinds of people. We'll get into serial killers who feel like it's about pure hatred for women. I dealt with a female serial killer who her life mission was to try and rid the earth of the nasty male race. And I'll get into that story here in a little bit. But those are more mission. They feel compelled for some purpose. If you think of some of the individuals in history who started atrocities like erasing other races or heading towards blacks and stuff, if you look at the leaders of those groups, they tend to have this kind of serial killing kind of psychopathological mindset. Okay. Hedonistic serial killers kill for the pure thrill and joy of it. The majority of serial killers are hedonistic serial killers, and this is where we'll be heading a little bit later when we look at lust serial killers. But most serial killers do it because of the pure joy and thrill they get off on it. When I first moved to Yuma, Arizona, they had a serial rapist issue, which is probably a very good example of the how to determine the cooling off period that someone goes through. Is that they thought it was random, that there was this transients that came through the town and were raping young girls that were walking down a certain street, and they just thought it was coincidental. And some rookie straight out of police training tried to convince the chief that it wasn't a random thing. And this is very rare in police departments, but the chief said, okay, well, you investigate and we'll see what we can do. And what they did is they looked at this individual and how they raped. And one way you could tell how long an emotional cooling period would be is by how long the perpetrator stays with the victim afterwards. Okay, and in this case, the rapist would put the young girl unconscious, would rape her brutally, and then would sit there for quite a while. There were traces everywhere where he would sit and masturbate to the young lady laying there. And based on that, they determined that these rapes would occur about every 90 days, based upon the amount of time they think that serial killer was spending viewing the incapacitated young lady. And sure enough, they set up a sting operation. They set it up for a week, and they caught him. And then based on the DNA evidence, the individual left, he was convicted. So, but he was doing it for just that pure thrill and joy. And that's a kind of an example of that how the emotional cooling period comes into this role. Okay. And then you have the power and control killer. They gain more satisfaction from exercising complete power over his victim, and sexual activity is almost always involved. This one, a lot of individuals think that this is what Dahmer was doing, because Dahmer was always felt like he was a victim. He was always ashamed of his sexuality, and so he wanted to dominate and control it. However, we also see with Dahmer, he took a lot of pleasure into what he was doing. So he's probably a combination of both of these. Power and control killers, if we look again at a lot of hate, people who are part of hate groups, extremist groups, you will find some of these kind of killers within those types of groups, because then they have that excuse to kill and have power and control over whichever group that group is trying to dominate or control. So this is an example of Ted Bundy, because one of the things that we know about, and please excuse the pictures, don't look at them if they're disturbing for you. I apologize. I forgot this was a part of a public presentation at one point, and it had to have some shock value. I apologize about that. I forgot about these images. When we look at Ted Bundy, and this is one thing that we'll get to here in a few minutes, is all serial killers have a preference, okay? Meaning that they seek out certain individuals with certain body types and hairstyles. And what we see with Ted Bundy is he preferred girls with dark hair, long, and split down the middle. We know that from his scenes, his preference was the use of restraints. Strangers were always the target, control the scene, weapons were always planned, and body was always transported somewhere. Okay, so this is what you call the MO. This was Ted Bundy's motive operandi, as you would say. I'm going to kind of skip through these because I'll post these. So if you want to go through them, it just gives the different weapons and everything that and how they control the scenes. And as you can see, I guess the one thing that I would say here in class, and then if you want to go look at this stuff later on, I'll post these slides in the classroom. But each of these motives, vision, missionary, hedonistic, we do have three types of hedonistic. There's lust, one does it for comfort, another does it for the pure thrill. So there are those three types. Each one has their own unique methods. So you see visionaries tend to improvise their weapons. It's a very aggressive thing for both the visionary and the lust. And then we get into weapon taking, controlled scene, target. And we see that the mission person is very methodical about that. And then we get into body disposed of, process focus, and usually rape. And we see that we get into the lust, thrill, and power and control taken in those. Interestingly, it's usually the power and control individuals that take a trophy. You've probably seen these shows where the individuals were taking a trophy, like a lock of hair or something like that. And these usually are denoted with the power and control. And then this is all different types of other things that they did with the victim. We won't go through those. But if you would like to look at these later, please go ahead. And then this is another kind of, and again, the thing about this graph that I'd encourage everyone to focus on, if you're interested in this, is that there's a difference between each of these types of individuals. There's some overlap, as you can see, but for the most part, they all have their own MO. All right. I want to talk about female serial killers, but I want to be very careful about how this is approached. Okay. Traditionally, female serial killers, there were no female counterparts to, for example, the Ted Bundys or the Gacy's, to whom sex or sex violence is a part of the murder pattern. That's traditionally, okay. We're seeing over the last couple of decades that females, which we will see in a slide here in just a minute, females are starting to take on the male serial killing methodology, which includes sexual violence as part of their murder process. And I do want to mention right now, I've been asked this before, is there really female sex offenders? The answer is yes. Can men be raped by women? Yes. You take about a 6-inch part of a broom, put it up their anus, and hit their prostate, and an uncontrollable erection occurs, and that's how those individuals are often raped. I know that was very graphic. I apologize about that, but I always get this thing, oh, men can't be raped. They sure can, and it hurts. But I have worked with female sex offenders before, and I will tell you the difference between male sex offenders and female sex offenders is in the beginning of a female sex offender pattern, it always involves some dominant male that kind of persuades the female into the sexual assault and sexual violence. So one of the individuals I worked with actually was doing a large prison sentence for assaulting her 13-year-old daughter and like 4 or 5 of her friends. And her pattern started something like this. She did have a methamphetamine problem. And one time she went to her dealer, she didn't have any money. And so she said, what can I do? I really need my meth. And it basically started like this, and I'll summarize it really quick. It started with, give me a picture of your daughter. Just a picture. Okay, there's a hit. Give me a picture of your daughter without her shirt on, and then her pants on, and her things off, and then bring your daughter here, and then take your daughter's clothes off, and then the male would assault the young girl, and then the next time he would say, now I want you to be involved with it, and then the next time he would go, you do this. You do it on your own. And what eventually happened, unfortunately for this offender, is eventually she would commit those sexual crimes on her own without the need of the prompting of her male counterpart or her male individual. So that's usually the evolution of female sex offenders, unlike men who do it either out of a moment of passion or indiscretion, which does not excuse it, or because of some twisted sexual fantasy that they have. Okay. Traditionally, though, when it comes to females who kill in serial killing, we have 2 types. We have an instrumental reason, or from a twisted notion of mercy. Okay, and I like I said, I really worked with 2 female serial killers. And this is where I want to bring up some things about serial killers. And we could see this in Ted Bundy, Gacy, and Dahmer as well, is that they have 2 faces. And that's why I use this picture, is that they tend to have 2 faces. They have a mask that they present to the world that makes people like them, makes people want to be around them. But behind that mask is a very, very dark mind, okay? A very twisted mind. And probably one of the best examples I have is one of the female serial killers I worked with was, by every report from her pre-sentencing hearing and everything, she was that perfect Christian church woman. Okay. And let me put it to this extreme. If I ever had a question about anything in the Bible, I would go to her, because even when she was confined, she read her Bible almost all the time. She prayed 4 or 5 times a day. She went to every church service she could go to. And she was very, very religious. On the outside, her pastor described her as the church mother. She would do the child care while they were doing meetings. She would stay after church services and help clean up. She was a member of the choir. She was always involved in the picnics and everything. And she was very, very involved with the church that she went to. But this young lady had a very nasty habit. She had this habit of getting involved with a man who had like a 9-10-year-old boy. And in about 2 or 3 years, she would burn the house down with those 2 individuals in it. Okay. Now, why 2 or 3 years? Well, if you think of the age 9, 2 or 3 years, the boy is getting to 11, 12, or the puberty years. Okay. And then she would burn the house down. And she stated, once none of her appeals were going to go through anymore, that she did this because she has an extreme hatred for men. She feels men are the reason Earth is ugly. Bad things happen. Okay. And in her justification, in her mind, what she was doing was she was allowing that boy to live through his childhood. And then she was just basically killing 2 birds with 1 stone. She was killing a man that already exists and a man that was becoming a man. And this is what we call instrumental reasons for killing someone. This was her MO. She wasn't caught because she did it in the state of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. And so all of these things were disconnected. And at that time, that was hard to connect the dots between law enforcement offices. My example from Twisted Notions of Mercy is if I worked with a elderly lady. She was very elderly. She was described, again, that face, right? She was described as the perfect grandma. She lived in a kind of a cul-de-sac that was in the middle of it had a pretty large park where children and everything were. And when she got caught, what happened is there was I can't remember her age. I apologize, gang. She was somewhere between the age of like 5 and 10. But she was in the park hooping and hollering and jumping around and just having fun. And the lady took a kitchen knife and she slit the young girl's throat. Okay. I'm sorry for the graphic description, but what was she doing? She was doing what's called a twisted notion of mercy. While everyone else saw that young girl having fun and enjoying life, in this offender's mind, she saw a girl suffering from her screaming, and she saw other people suffering because of her screaming and her jumping around. And so she was relieving the little girl and everyone else in the park from that girl's suffering. Okay. Now, I will tell you, as far as mental illness is concerned, this individual did have a pretty severe, we talked about the personality disorder. Oh my goodness. This one had one of our personality disorders, and I cannot remember the name of it. Borderline personality disorder, and she had a severe version of it. Okay. However, the person who did the instrumental reasons really didn't have any diagnosable mental disorders. But I just want to bring that up because sometimes mental disorders can coexist, and it's kind of thought that in this case, she was having one of those spiraling moments with her borderline personality disorder, and she kind of became disconnected from reality. But unfortunately, they found cases. She was only convicted on this one, but there were about 3 or 4 that were very similar to this one, and she gets categorized in this category. Okay, so those are 2 examples of instrumental versus twisted notions of mercy. But as I mentioned, these used to be the traditional types of female serial killers. But over the last couple decades, we're finding that there are different types. You'll notice that we are now dealing with visionary serial killers, hedonistic, and power seeking, just like male serial killers. But there's also 2 other types. One is the disciple. Probably, even though this wasn't in the last couple decades, the example of this one was were the young ladies who killed for that guy in California. Oh my goodness, I'm having name issues today. The guy who did Helter Skelter. I just
Charles
cannot.
Manson.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the young ladies who killed for Charles Manson would probably be the best example of this type of murder. And then we also find that an increasing number of comfort female serial killers who are motivated more by extrinsic things like material gains, life insurance, and the like. So, and in this one, in the comfort one, what makes them a little bit different than other serial killers is they're often very known by the person that they killed. There's an emotional relationship of some type there. Okay, so again, as we see time progress, we're seeing these types of evils. Men used to be the ones who did the most awful things. But we're starting to see, again, I mentioned that for male homicides, and this includes serial killing, that's kind of evened off. And we're seeing still a slow tick of female serial killers. Curious, I haven't seen what's called a projection analysis or a forecast, what's called forecasting. I'm kind of wondering at what year, if the trends continue, there won't be a complete difference between male and female offenders. It's kind of an interesting thought to think about. And just as we saw with the male offenders, we take each of these types, right? And we can see that there's differences in methodology, in the type of harm that they do, and those kinds of things. Also, when we're looking at female serial killers, and then we'll go ahead and move on, we also see that there's some personality types that can be associated with this, because one of the things in the literature, as I've been talking about psychopathology, is with females, there's not always this perfect one-to-one association with the psychopath personality. In that, for a lot of female psychopaths, we still see in some domains of their life where they can be very caring, those types of things, and other domains they're not. And so for females, we have to complicate the psychopathology kind of diagnosis into these 4 basic categories. Okay, so we have the interpersonal category where there's superficial, grandiosity, lie. They tend to be cunning and manipulative. In the affective one, and this is something that is very different from non-psychopathic women, is we find that women usually score pretty high on remorse. Okay, but we're finding this certain type of individual really feeling almost callous towards, there's a word, callous towards individuals. In their lifestyle, they tend to be impulsive, simulation seeking, and much like some of the categories of psychopaths. We see a parasitic lifestyle where they go from house to house. And this is male and female. We see this with psychopaths, is they'll go from house to house and basically drain those people dry, and then they'll go to the next house and the next house. And we see antisocial behaviors such as poor behavior control, delinquency, some criminal behavior, early behavior problems. So this is kind of what we see when we're dealing with specifically the female type. And this is just something from Alina Warnos. This is one of what's his name's followers. Jeez. I killed those 7 men to for murder and robbery, not so much for the thrill of killing. I was into robbery biz. I was into robbery and eliminating witnesses. I'm pretty much had them selected as they were gonna die. There was no self-defense. And you see that in this statement, the thing that I want you to notice is just the callousness, the emotional disconnect. She's describing it as it was just what she did, like going down to Circle K and pumping gas in your car. That's what you do. And this is what we often see with a lot of these individuals. All right. So what I like to summarize what we've talked about so far is using what's called the Diathis stress model of serial killing, okay? And we see that there's 3 ingredients. If we think about this as kind of baking a cake, right? We have these 3 basic ingredients. We have biological predispositions, okay? So, which include low arousal levels, prefrontal cortex damage. So there is that impulse control issues, those kinds of things that come from the damage of the communication between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, like we talked about on Tuesday. And then we see predisposition. We usually see what it's hard to describe, because with self-esteem, if you read a serial killer's diary or something like that, you would measure these individuals as very low on self-esteem. But if you give them a measure, they actually have an inflated sense of self-esteem. So there is a disconnect between what they're trying to present to the world and what they're really feeling inside. Okay, and we call this kind of a dissociative state between, or a dissonant state between what you project and what you feel, and they have to deal with that dissonance and that difference. We see self-control issues. So again, going back to impulsive, not being able to deal with, not be able to control one's behavior. That, if we think about that, that's probably due to the damage between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. And in many cases, we see some type of sexual dysfunction, the inability to, for example, get sexually aroused without doing some type of extreme behavior such as violence. Okay. And then we see some maladaptive coping skills. Okay, now we all do this. I think if in one of my classes, I'm sure that I was boring the heck out of you and your mind went somewhere else. Or if you're in a stressful situation, you kind of take yourself back and you retreat for a little while into your mind. Okay. And we call this retreating to the fantasy world. Okay. The problem is with all of these dispositional and biological issues, it starts to become harder and harder for these individuals to leave their fantasy world. Okay. And so with the example that I gave you with the two serial killers I worked with, they go into a dissociative state, where in the example we have the church mother on one end, and then that very dark, hateful beast that's behind it. And it becomes harder and harder to retreat from that fantasy world. And then eventually what happens is the fantasy world and the reality world can collide together. And that person then acts out that fantasy world in the real world. And this is what ends up being the first kill. Okay. Now, let me stop with this. This is what it takes to get to the first kill. Okay. But I know this sounds kind of sadistic on a human end side, but understand it has survival purposes. Dopamine is the reward chemical in our brain. It is the thing that brings us great satisfaction when we've done something really good. Okay. And natural production of dopamine that at its highest levels occurs during two activities in a human being. The highest amount of dopamine we can produce is when we're having a sexual orgasm, or when we're clocking someone across the face with a fist. Our brain loves both of those. And it can, and if you think about the extreme violence that these individuals are putting on it, the brain is just loving it that much more. Now, I mentioned this has survival reasons, and let me explain. I want you to think about this. In a normal setting, the reason why you are physically defending yourself with your fists or your legs is because there's a potential danger. You're protecting yourself from danger. So your brain is saying, good job. Thank you for doing that. Here's a shot of dopamine. Okay. But that evolutionary process also can result into some continued negative behaviors. Okay. And what we find is that thrill of that first kill. After that, you don't need any of these other things. None of these need to exist for the second, third, fourth, fifth murder to occur. Okay. And this is also why we have found that treatment is individuals with serial killing tendency, treatment is not that effective, because we could put them through a self-esteem program. We can teach them self-control. We can teach them coping skills. We can teach them, we can get them with a medical provider to deal with some of the sexual dysfunction and these biological issues. Whoops. Okay. We can work with them with their dissociative state. There's some pretty good therapies for dissociative states, like has been described earlier in the class. But we can give all the skills we want to these individuals, and it will not prevent the second, third, fourth, or fifth kill, because it is now, if you want to put it this way, biologically, intimately, social, and psychologically tied to the individual. Okay. And this is what makes this type of person unsafe once they're caught to be readmitted into society. All right, gang. I think I'm going to leave this one because I want to check in with everybody and see how everyone's going. So I'm going to end this